So to say that liberal democratic constitutionalism is on the defensive is to state an euphemistic platitude. The celebrated third wave of democratization that was supposed to bring about the end of history has proven to be a temporary and fragile interlude rather than a lasting state of affairs. What only 3 decades ago has been cheered as the ultimate victory in the competition of regimes and ideologies is experiencing external and internal pressures. The third wave of democratization coincided with the rise of the concept of self-binding in constitutional theory. The locus classicus is Jon Elster's work on precommitment, but the concept has been picked up by other scholars to understand challenges facing emerging democracies, and made its way to the constitutional theoretical vernacular. The collapse of the normative framework that it informed and that served as an aspirational benchmark during the third wave of democratization puts the usefulness of this understanding of constitutionalism and of self-binding that comes from Elster into question. At the same time, I claim that it warrants revisiting this once influential metaphor to expose the limits of its traditional understanding and to explore the overlooked potential. Hence, the purpose of this paper is to revisit the idea of self-binding by exploring the dimensions of the original basis of the metaphor, that is the story of Ulysses and the sirens, that remained overlooked or ignored in the traditional interpretation, and to explore diverse meanings of the word binding, right? The aim is to treat self-binding as a heuristic device to better understand the challenges of constitutionalism today and to draw normative conclusions on how to proceed forward with the democratic ideal of self-government in mind. So the basis, we all know the basis of the story, of the metaphor, right? Ulysses is supposed to sail next to the sirens. The sirens have this beautiful voice, and they lure sailors onto the rocks, and they die, right? So, but Ulysses is smart, so he asks his crew to tie him to the mast, and that's why he manages to evade the luring songs of the sirens, right? In this story, Jon Elster sees a more universal model for addressing the problem of precommitment by imposing on oneself temporary restrictions. And I quote here, to bind oneself is to carry out a certain decision at time t1 in order to increase the probability that one will carry out another decision at time t2. In the words of Klaus Offe, self-binding subject makes sure that the undesired action becomes impossible for him due to external circumstances, or in a weaker reading, becomes costly enough to be a deterrent. Although Elster acknowledges the problems of transferring this individual model of dealing with the issue of precommitment to the level of collectivity, he nonetheless states that we can view constitutions in a very similar way, right? And the reason is because for him, radical democracy and despotism, both, and here's a quote from him, are based on the right to current intervention in all matters, whereas constitutional democracy is founded upon a set of stable institutions that cannot be undone at will once established, right? And this common right to intervention in all matters is not just an accidental affinity. He says that total freedom, and this is again a quote, total freedom passes over into total unfreedom, both in the conceptual sense that liberty unlimited is slavery, and in the causal sense that the anarchy of total liberty tends to prepare the ground for a dictator. Hence, we need constitutions, right? Hence, we need constitutions as self-limitations. Radical democracy and despotism are not identical, but rather they are mirror images of each other. One is unable to secure stability because of weakness of the loci of institutional power, while the other because of the concentration of power in one unchecked locus, right? So this constitutional democracy, or constitutionalism understood as self-binding, right, is the Ulysses strategy to address the problem, right, and this strategy is to pre-commit later generations by laying down a constitution, including clauses that prevent its being easily changed. Right, and this idea is picked up, for example, by Stephen Holmes, who says that self-binding in general might be one of the main gifts of constitutionalism to democracy. And it is so because, according to Holmes, and I quote, democracy becomes possible only when certain emotionally charged solidarities and commitments are displaced from the political realm, right? He talks about self-gagging, but it generally is a broader model of basically excluding certain issues from decision-making, right? For both in Elster and Holmes, the pivotal role is assigned to the framing of the Constitution, which later binds the collectivity. It is so because, as Klaus Offe observed in his reflection on Elster's work on constitution making, constitutions limit the range of future action of those bound by them. And this autopaternalism, as Holmes calls it, is justified because it enables democratic self-government. And again, a longer quote from Holmes. If we take for granted certain procedures and institutions fixed in the past, we can achieve our present goals more effectively than we could if we were constantly being sidetracked by the recurrent need to establish a basic framework for political life. An inherited constitution can be democracy enabling and as well as democracy stabilizing. It is not essentially a hedge against arbitrary government. Because it is relatively hard to change, a constitution can disencumber, that is, emancipate the present generation. What does it emancipate the people from the making of the fundamental decisions regarding the shape of the democratic constitution, right? So formally speaking, right, we can treat self-binding, right, as both an act and a device, right? As an act, it is a decision at the time T1 to exclude certain options from decision-making at the time T2. As a device, it is a straitjacket on democratic decision-making. It functions as an external limitation and not just self-restraint, right? And self-binding, as you can see here at the bottom, right, from the quote from Elster, right, self-binding is the power of a subject to make itself powerless. In other words, self-binding is about disempowerment, right? Now, there are problems with that, right, with that understanding of self-binding, right? And I would like to shed those or illuminate those problems by showing that there are certain elements of the original story that do not make it into the to the metaphor, right? And like there are three of them, and the first one I call the principal agent problem, right? Oh, by the way, and it is important, right? I mean, self-binding, right? When you take into account all those three elements, right, that are one way or the other overlooked, right? Self-binding becomes a misnomer because, as Hubertus Buchstein said, right, self-binding is always being bound by others, right? So first, what I want to address is the principal agent problem, right? And the problem of asymmetry instituted by self-binding, right? The story goes that Ulysses is bound to the mast, and this makes him self-bound. Well, the problem is that he didn't bind himself. He used his authority as the captain of the ship to order his crew to bind him, right? And this inverted the original relationship of power because through this self-binding, right, he empowered people who allegedly are supposed to listen to him, his agents, right, to basically ignore his pleas to be released, right? And if we want to transpose it into the issue of constitutional theory, and if the principle is the people and the agent is the government, broadly speaking, or some institutions of government, then we have the idea of self-binding. In the end of the day, is empowering the government to ignore popular demands, right? Or can be seen like that. What I want to emphasize here is that the self-binding is in this case institutes asymmetry, and this asymmetry is also a relationship of power, right? The other problem is the image of the simultaneous presence of the binding and the bound, and the problem of identity, right? The problem here is that the convincing applicability of the metaphor of self-binding hinges on accepting that the actor who performs the binding in time t1 is at the same time is the same as the one who is constrained in the time t2. The problem is that in reality, framers of constitutions do not bind themselves, but primarily bind others who come after them, right? Elster recognizes this issue when he calls it the paradox of democracy, and here I quote, "Each generation wants to be free to bind its successors while not being bound by its predecessors." But there is a problem, right? There is a deeper problem, right? The fundamental asymmetry of self-binding, understood in this way, is that the only founding generation can be said to have bound itself, while the subsequent generations are bound by the framers, right? And the problem is deeper than just the question of intergenerational continuity of the collective actor, right? The crux of the issue is whether the bound, right, recognize themselves and the binding as the same actor, right? And the metaphor of self-binding hinges on the fundamental identity of the binding and the bound, right? And this is something that has been questioned repeatedly by the ones who are considered examples of democratic backsliding, meaning Orban, meaning Kaczynski, and so on and so forth. They are coming to power in order to redress the original sin of the imposition of illegitimate order, right? So there is a rejection of this identity of the binding and the bound, right? And the third problem the third thing that is not really taken seriously in the original reading of the metaphor, right, is the image of the bound community and the problem of external influence, right? So here, right, Ulysses and his crew are on a ship that is surrounded by the sea, right? There are no other ships. They don't interact with other ships. Ulysses is bound to the mast that is to a part of the ship. So in a way, the act of self-binding in this traditional interpretation occurs exclusively for and within the self-binding community. The only external influence is the song of the sirens, right? The problem with this image, right, is that it's not really true even within the original story, right? Because Ulysses did not get the idea of being bound to the mast from his brilliance, right? He is given that idea by Kirke, his lover, right? And this poses a question of not only the external influence or potential external influence on the ones who are supposed to be bound by the Constitution, but a potential external influence, right, on those who are doing the binding, right? Why, for what reasons, and so on and so forth, right? We can imagine that to make it a little bit more tangible, right? There are many ways in which this influence can happen, right? For example, the adoption of the U.S. model by Latin American countries right after the American independence and Latin American wars of independence, right? It was genuine inspiration, right? Or Central and Eastern European shock therapies, which basically were conditions for badly needed resources, or the implementation of these self-binding mechanisms can be the condition of joining an exclusive club, right? Like the condition of accessing the EU, right? Okay. From this elaboration of the three neglected dimensions, we can see that an image of self-binding is actually always being bound or binding others, right? Being bound by others and binding others, right? And in his very illuminating critique of self-binding, Bockstein says that we should basically drop the idea of self-binding because it cannot be it cannot be resurrected, or it cannot be saved, right? Well, I suggest a different idea, a different path forward, right? This path would be to basically try to broaden the scope of what we understand by self-binding to make it a little bit more applicable, right? So I suggest that we can do it by expanding what we understand by binding and enriching the meaning of the word binding by, for example, looking at what can be learned from other languages than just English, right? So the first thing that I would like to show, right, is like how we can understand binding, right? Binding as binding together with a band or a string, right? Think about hay, right? So a sheaf of hay is basically columns of hay bound together by a string, or more traditionally by other columns used as a string, right? What distinguishes a sheaf from a haycock, right, is the fact that the columns of hay, the hay is bound, right? There is a distinction between what is inside the sheaf, right, and what is outside, right? There is no such a thing as inside-outside distinction in the case of haycock, right? So in other words, what we are dealing with in this understanding of binding, right, is we are dealing with the establishment of the distinction between the inside and outside, and establishment of the relationship between the inside and the outside, right? And this would be a broader interpretation of the act of binding, right? There is also a broader or different interpretation of the device of binding, right? Not binding to a mast, unmovable piece of ship, right? By binding as in snowboarding, right? Here, the binding does not mean that you're restricted, right? I mean, it means that you're restricted a little bit, but actually, in the end of the day, the binding allows the the transmission of the movement of the snowboarder onto an object, right? And in this way gives more control both over the object and over the movement in general, right? Whoever did anything on ski or snowboarding knows what I'm talking about. Try skiing or snowboarding without bindings, fixed bindings. It's a disaster, right? And the third thing that I wanted to suggest, right, is right, Polish meaning of binding, right? Binding comes from to bind, right, which means which is wiązać in Polish, right? And to bind someone to the mast, in order to bind someone to the mast, you have to add a prefix przy, right? Przywiązać, right? But in order to tie the rope with which you bind someone to the mast, right, you need to zawiązać, right? The thing is that zawiązać also means to establish, to generate, to create something new, right? And crucially, unlike założyć in Polish, it involves more than two or more actors, right? And if you add the reflexive chien to that, like you can say that friendship, zawiązać się, right? It emerges from multiple actors and it unfolds in the future, right? So where does it leave us, right? So self-binding, we should understand self-binding not just as binding as self-limitation, right? But in a generative sense, in a constituent sense, right? Self-binding as a constituent act, right? Self-binding also is very much, or should be read as very much sensitive to the distinction between the inside and the outside, and how that distinction is established. The fact that you cannot zawiązać, for example, association, having just one person, right? It indicates that there needs to be a plurality of actors, right? And this points to the need for the sensitivity to the new collective self, right? And the imminent establishment of the bonds among the ones who establish this new thing, right? And and how the relations with institutions are established. I actually have several more slides that say how we can develop from there more democratic understanding of self-binding, but I guess I don't really have time. So at this moment I have to stop, but I wish I didn't. But anyway, thank you very much. So first, requirements.
This is the first question.
First we need to extract requirements, normative requirements from this expansive understanding of self-binding, right? And there is a collective authorship, right? And the requirement of collective authorship is compound in itself, right? There is a plurality and participation. Another requirement is the connection between the constituent and the institutions via unfolding, right? And this is the participation part as well. Okay. And Andrew Arato, obviously.
Okay.
And federalism is a part of that.
Thank you, Jan. So my question is actually about what makes the self-binding procedure democratic, because this is one thing that you didn't really discuss as a possible problem. You just discussed possible problems with the image of Ulysses, but let's say I'm a British and I want to bind myself to monarchy and I like it that way, and I think it emancipates me from having to worry about the government. I just like the Queen and that's it. Like, why would I have to be democratic? Why wouldn't I be a royalist?
So should we? No, let me quickly respond. As you see here, right? The meaning of self-binding does not really have much. This here does not have democratic content, because I think that this is how we should, this is more expansive understanding of constitutionalism as self-binding. We can then take another step and make it into a more democratic concept, but it does not, self-binding is not necessarily a democratic concept, right? The question of the relationship between or the distinction with the outside is one of the fundamental here. You can have it in different ways. You can have an imperial separation between the inside and the outside, or relationship with the inside and the outside. You can have the status illusion of impermeability of borders. You can have Großraum style of relationship between the inside and the outside, right? When the Reich actually decide what is inside, what is outside, right? And not you, but you're still bound by that, right? So and federalism here is the only one that actually allows for co-determination of what is inside and what is outside, right? And co-participation in the determination of that distinction. So, right, there is nothing necessarily democratic. It just you can extract certain requirements that can lead us to more democratic ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks so much. Well, first of all, this is a very important topic, and I mentioned yesterday that the discussion within constitutional law goes back to the German school and to Jelinek, etc. So it's interesting that the American school then retakes the same topic like 100 years later, probably without quoting the source as usual. But there is a crucial difference, of course, that the Americans talk about democracy, and they want the people, the demos, to bind itself. But for Jelinek, of course, it was the king, the Kaiser, who had to bind himself. And one could say that that's the difference, and okay, so all of this doesn't apply. But is there a difference? In both cases, we are talking about the relationship to sovereign power. Basically, we are talking about the theory of sovereignty. And how can there be a sovereignty if we have a rule of law? Only through self-binding. So it's a legal fiction in a way. But it's a legal fiction that allows us to have sovereignty, and that means also to know that there is always a potential of violence and civil war within the Constitution. If we don't accept this, we are naive. If we don't accept that the king can just execute 1,000 of militants on the square, we are naive. If we say no binding for the people, and if we don't remember that the 100,000 of angry people on the square can, I don't know, for example, kill a couple thousand Jews or something, then we are also naive. We shouldn't be naive. And I think this is it's a great norm, this self-binding.
I actually, if you mean this self-binding as self-limitation, I actually have in the last slide how we can reinterpret in a more democratic way self-binding, not necessarily as self-limitation, but as limitation by inviting more actors to decision-making, right? So I am limited, right, not through my, quasi-sovereign decision not to execute some of my powers, right, or not to, commit a pogrom, right, but by, inviting a Jewish community to making a decision. Obviously, this is a normative. This is a normative part, how things should be, right? So it does not. I mean, if a mob decides to, commit a pogrom, then obviously there is a problem, right? And the theory cannot really solve that, right? But yeah, so I think that this more expansive idea of self-binding actually implies a different way of self-limitation. Self-limitation by inviting more people to collective decision-making, and therefore, having their input and limiting the scope of decision-making through that.
Yeah, I have a short question, but maybe the answer is in the slides that you couldn't show. Well, I mean, there was in the first understanding of self-binding that you criticized, there is this point of externality, that there is some kind of external power that actually kind of supervises whether this self-binding is actually still exists. And in contemporary constitutional state, what is it in Germany? Verfassungsschutz / also police. So in a sense, from fiction of popular sovereignty, we kind of immediately shift to the reality of police violence in a certain way, as if also this kind of violent underside. And then you say that, well, there is another idea of self-binding, as if we can kind of switch perspective on the same kind of phenomena, and things will, I don't know, turn to the better. But of course, that's not the case. So what lies between? I mean, except for the revolution or constitutional amendment, and whether this in between is accidental to what is it supposed to bring about?
It's a good question that I don't really have answer to, right? I mean, so I'm assuming that you're asking about a practical.
And if this practice is actually,
I mean, you know, I mean, it does not really directly derive from this idea, right? If it derives from this idea only indirectly, like if you really want to institute a revolutionary break, then you kind of should follow the these ideas, like for example, this one about the constituent action, right? Multiplicity of actors, multi-stage process, right? And the Founding Compact as, you know, institution enactment and institutional reciprocity. Whether it happens, it's a different story, right? And I can't really, you know, say that it will, right? I'm not here in the business of predicting future. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's very interesting speech and very interesting concept that, of course, self-binding, it's really important to do this, but I think like in this sense, maybe the most important thing it's which thing you self-bind yourself to, which, and then we're starting to talk about, you know, values and how these values were chosen, because binding, you know, this связывать, it's not only bind yourself like to the, I don't know, democracy or to the king, but also, you know, in fascism, you know, fascism, it's a binding also, so we can self-bind yourself to a lot of things, and you know that's some of concerns.
Yeah, I mean, so again, right? The idea of self-binding as such does not necessarily have the democratic content, right? But if I were to respond, I think that, you know, I would go. I mean, responding very, very briefly, I would kind of choose the Artemis way from yesterday as, you know, binding to institutions, and through institutions, and particularly institutions as places of articulation for actors to meet, discuss, disagree, and so on and so forth, right? Sites of articulation of the plurality, right? In which the plurality can, well, you know, not necessarily unite, but act together, right? Act in concert, right?
Thank you very much. I think we will